leather print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hi, this is Dick Shanley, and for the next hour I'll be reading from Sunday, March 8th, issue of the New York Times opinion section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This article is written by Ross Douthart. The Shadow of Iraq over Trump's war. The best essay for understanding right-wing support for Donald Trump's war against Iran was published in National Review in 2023 at the 20th anniversary of the Iraq invasion. Written by Tanner Greer, a conservative writer and China analyst. It argued that the official populist repudiation of George W. Bush and neoconservatism mask a deep continuity between the Iraqi-era conservative mainstream and the Trump-era new right. Both the Bushers, hawks, and the Trumpian right, Greer suggested, were profoundly concerned with civilization decadence and how it might be escaped. Both yearned for national purpose. Both displayed a vitalist drive. Both looked for ways to break out of the limited horizons imposed by liberal convention, wisdom, and post-Cold War consensus. Neoconservatives then cared more about democracy and human rights, officially, than most Trump supporters now. But the Iraq hawks cared most profoundly about power, in a way that's entirely relevant today. The famous quote from a Bush official about how when we act, we create our own reality directly anticipated the Trump-era belief that you can just do things. But the Trump era zone of action was supposed to be the administrative state, immigration policy, higher education, rather than the Middle East. But it's not surprising that the same spirit could be extended to a new round of war-making, a friend-slash-enemy battle with the mullahs, rather than the liberal elite, as the existential threat. The arguments for democracy promotion that were stapled into the Iraq War have been torn away. Bill Kristol, basically a Democrat now, and Dick Cheney died a committed foe of Trump. But the spirit of Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld brewed over the Trump administration nonetheless. That spirit is not all-encompassing, and the failure of hawkish foreign policy have some real effects. That's why you have a wider range of anti-war and war-skeptical voices on the right, from Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon to Matt Walsh and Megyn Kelly and Bronze Age pervert that you did in 2002 and 2003. In a world where the Iranian intervention goes badly, it won't take more than a decade for the right to repudiate it. The anti-war right could be reascended as soon as the 2028 primary campaign. But at the moment, most Republicans support the war, and that support extends beyond the hawkish reflexes of older GOP voters to include plenty of younger, very online and very Trumpy voices. My timeline is filled with social media grand strategists, and right-wing anons that professed post-liberal making completed geopolitical arguments about the benefits of the Iran war that reminded me of the arguments I heard from Iraq Hawk 20 years ago. Or that I made myself even after too many beers at a DC happy hour. And that they joined by based voices asserting that the war is totally different from Bush's war, a completely different paradigm, because Trump understands strength in a way the Bushies never did. Some of these writers can be forgiven for this perspective because they are young enough never to have watched a Rumsfeld news conference. But the idea that America can go into a rough neighborhood, hit our enemies hard, kill some of their leaders, and force them to respect our hegemony is not some brilliant innovation of the based Trump era. It was a dominant right-wing perspective on the Iraq war, and indeed sometimes a centrist perspective as well, especially in the run-up to the narrative, with democracy promotion very much a minor theme. And the failure in Iraq was as much a failure of this kind of we win, they lose militarism as it was a failure of Wilsonian idealism. Now history's recursions are never simple, and what is definitely true about Trump, what gives me some optimism that this war will have a better outcome than Iraq, is that he's much more flexible and adaptable, more happily inconsistent and open for negotiations than the hawks of the Bush era. He desires to crush his enemies and see them driven before him coexist, with a willingness to cut his losses at any moment, depending on the options and the performance of the stock market. Did he say last week that he'll accept anything but unconditional surrender? Check again next week. He might say something else. Is he toying with the idea of sending ground troops into Iran? Allegedly, but he might have the opposite view if the next person who talks to him emphasizes the word quagmire. Did his Secretary of State call the Iranian leadership religious fanatic lunatics? Sure. But if declaring victory requires making a deal with the religious fanatic lunatic, Trump will be okay with that. It's in this flexibility that I put my hope, rather than a supposed reality, creating powers of Trumpian reserve. But as with conservatives in the Bush era, so today, the desire for a revolutionary presidency gives hubris a lot of space to work. This is written by Nicholas Kristof. He's one of my favorites, but all these writers are. Joy among Iranians may not last. After I wrote a column criticizing the folly of attacking Iran, I had pushback from some Iranians who understand the region far better than I ever will. We, the Iranians, wanted this, one replied on social media. You don't know how it's like to live under the boots of one of the most brutal regiments. They raise a fair question. If some Iranians are celebrating in the streets, so desperate for change that they welcome the bombing of their own cities, should we object? I sympathize with those Iranians because I've seen the oppression firsthand in my own reporting in Iran over the years. Police officers swooping in on my interviews, security thugs shouting at women to cover up. An intelligence agent who once detained me in Tehran accused me of being a spy and told me I could be imprisoned indefinitely until I confessed. It is terrifying to feel the breath of Iran's dictatorship on your neck. In Iran, I saw resentment of the regime everywhere. Once I encountered it even in the office of a Grand Ayatollah in the holy city of Qom. My interpreter jokingly introduced me as coming from the great Satan, and an aide to the Ayatollah responded with a laugh. America is only baby Satan. We have big Satan right here at home. Iran contains multitudes, of course. The regime does have supporters, especially in rural areas. And even among reformers, there is some fear that the war will make things worse and perhaps threaten the nation's survival. When I asked one Iranian dissident what he expected from the war, he was pithy. Nothing good. While it's natural for some Iranians to hope that the war can liberate their country and let them breathe again, I also remember being in Kabul early in the Afghanistan war and having Afghans tell me how thrilled they were to see the last of the Taliban. I witnessed crowds in Basra, Iraq, celebrating the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. In Tripoli, Libya, I saw throngs cheering the Americans' intervention. In short, initial enthusiasm is not a reliable predictor of success. For now, the Iranian regime is not crumbling, but rather expanding the war. The Iranian people are not overthrowing their government, and the war is spreading across the region. Aside from the deaths of Iranians, Americans and others, oil and gas prices are rising, and shipping through the Strait of Hormuz is being choked off. The suffering is left even far away. UNICEF reported that 18,000 children were displaced in Lebanon after the war reached that country. All this had cost Americans, by one estimate, $5 billion a day, 3 of the war. The Trump administration may be about to add to chaos by supporting armed Kurdish separatists, perhaps propelling Iran towards civil war. Syria's civil war sent millions of refugees across the world, and a similar conflict inside Iran, with roughly 4 times the population of Syria, could lead to even greater flows of refugees, especially if ethnic conflicts involving Kurds or Baluchis, that's spelled Baluchis, Baluchis, spill over to neighboring countries. But, we killed Iran's supreme leader. Yes, that's true. But while Americans saw the killing of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei as a way to weaken his regime, there's some reason to think that Khomeini's welcome by his own martyrdom in a way strengthened it. Indeed, his son, Mojtaba Khomeini, is now said to be a leading candidate to become the new paramount leader, a way for hardliners to perpetuate their brutality. An editorial comment, the son has been appointed chief mullah. The security apparatus, especially the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, with which the younger Khomeini has close ties, seems likely to play a more significant role in Iran. That could mean even more enthusiasm for nuclear weapons and regional proxy forces. Look, we need some humility here. It is, of course, still possible that the regime will collapse and then a democratic Iran will emerge. Occasionally, optimists are correct, even in the Middle East. The outcome of this war may depend in part of whether Iran's out of missiles and drones first, or we exhaust our supply of interception first. Depletion of munitions for this unnecessary war is a real problem. Linda Bills, a Harvard expert on the cost of wars, told me that the United States used up more than 20% of its entire worldwide stockpile of THAAD, T-H-A-A-D, interceptors last year, defending Israel during the 12-day war with Iran. And even if our stockpiles of THAADs, Patriots, and Tomahawks are adequate, it may take years to restore supply levels for the next crises. One of America's great senators, J. William Fulbright, responded to the Vietnam War in 1966 by denouncing what he called the arrogance of power. He cautioned power confuses itself with virtue and tends also to take itself for omnipotence. He framed it this way: we're still acting like Boy Scouts dragging reluctant old ladies across the streets that do not want to cross. Editorial comment, that's pretty good. In Iraq, our arrogance of power led us to start a war that ended up costing hundreds of thousands of lives, mostly Iraqis, and perhaps $3 trillion, and ultimately benefit Iran. In Afghanistan, we wasted lives in some $3.4 trillion over 2 decades to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. Having covered both wars and had friends killed and injured there, I fear that Trump's new era in the national located between Iraq and Afghanistan will similarly end in mangled bodies and shattered hopes. President Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, the architects of this war, both seem afflicted by the arrogance of power. It was Netanyahu in 2002 told the U.S. Congress, if you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee that it will have enormous positive reverberations in the region. And I think that people sitting right next door in Iran, young people and many others, will say the time of such regime, of such despots is gone. I have no evidence that Trump stated this war to distract us from Epstein files or other political troubles. But in 2012, Trump did tweet, now that Obama's poll numbers are in tailspin, watch for him to launch a strike in Libya or Iran. I also don't know to what degree Netanyahu has pushed Trump into this war. But what do I believe is that Trump and Netanyahu, we are seeing tactical brilliance harnessed in a strategic confusion with no clear goals or off-ramp. I worry that if the war stalls, Trump could even put boots on the ground on Karg Island, Iran's oil base, making us even deeper into a potential quagmire. A president's first act is to make safer. Indeed, it seems to me that Trump has catapulted us into an unnecessary conflict, consuming American and Iranian lives alike, costing billions of dollars and damaging the economy, all while propelling us in peril. This article is written by Maureen Dowd. Wuthering House, MAGA style. Christie and Corey converted in the swamp as Department of Home Security got bogged down. Eat your heart out, Emerald Fennell. You may have the alluring stars Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi converting on the moors in your crimson adaptation of Wuthering Heights. But for radioactive romance, you can't beat Washington. Emily Bronte's Kathy and Heathcliff are selfish, manipulative creatures destroying each other and all around them. But their damage was kept to one windswept village. With MAGA's version of Wuthering Heights, the far less alluring but equally intertwined Kristi Noem and Corey Lewandowski have been converting over the swamp, scandalizing the capital as they spread their cruelty far and wide. to Lewandowski's credit, he didn't try to kill a dog like Heathcliff did. That's Noam's department. Holiday Barbie, as Roby's Kathy, has been dubbed for ostentatious dresses and styles that pales in comparison with the costumes and Rapunzel extension of ice. Barbie, imprisoned in her marriage to Edgar Linton, Robbie's Kathy gleans in elaborate gowns and necklaces, but Noam topped that. When she went to see migrants in prison in El Salvador, she sported a baseball cap with an Immigration and Customs Enforcement logo and a gold Rolex Cosmograph Daytona that's worth $50,000. President Trump has rejected the plea of Lewandowski, who managed Trump's 2016, until he got fired after dust-ups with the Trump family and others, to be NARM's chief of staff because Trump was disturbed by the optics of Lewandowski working as chief of staff to someone with whom he had reportedly been romantically involved. As the Atlantic Ashley Parker and Michael Scherer put it, Noam and Lewandowski, who are both married with children, have denied the affair. Christine Corey in the Department of Homeland Security as a temporary special government employee and made him her powerful aide-de-camp. He has stayed long beyond his allotted 130 days. For a time, Trump let it ride, even though, according to the New York Post, he cringed when he saw them flagrantly taking sips from the same can of soda, an unmistakable tell. An Atlantic story called Lewandowski and Noam the first couple of a dysfunctional Department of Home Security. As Noam enforcer and promoter, Lewandowski had a hand in every decision. An upcoming book by NBC News reporter Julia Ainsley reveals that senior officials had a secret meeting in 2025 after Trump was sworn in to discuss what they saw as the most toxic romance warping or withering. The agency's plan as it embarked on the barbaric roundup of illegal immigrants, the rough manhunt drained the Department of Compassion as it attempted to build up Noam and capture headlines. Lewandowski tried to think of ways to redeem Noam after the distinguishedly called Renee Good and Alex Preter, victims of her ICE run amok domestic terrorist. Like Catherine, Wuthering Heights' name was aspirational, always trying to move up. Kathy treated up to the big house nearby. Christie commandeered the Coast Guard Commandant's waterfront residence, but her tactics were too flashy and narcissistic, even for Trump. She and Lewandowski jetted around in a luxury 737 MAX, according to the Wall Street Journal, and once high-handedly tried to dismiss their Coast Guard pilot when he failed to transfer her balance to a different, when he tried to transfer her blanket to a different plane. They had to get him back since they realized there was no one to fly them home. Other accounts say it was her bag that was left. But what was in that bag could cause such a ruckus. Axios reported that Noam had planned to use border funds for an almost $300 million luxury jet fleet for DHS. It was the end for Noam when she was quizzed at her hearing Tuesday by Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana about spending $220 million on glossy commercials, including one where she wore a cowboy hat and rode a horse near Mount Rushmore. She should have known better than to bring attention from the president, the biggest attention hog of all time. A skeptical Kennedy pressed Noem about whether Trump had signed off on the ads, and she said that he had. The Senate reported that the president called him afterwards mad as a mama wasp, denying he knew about the ads. At that moment, Kennedy said she was dead as fried chicken. Now Democrats are investigating whether Noem and Lewandowski gamed the system on their ad contract, which looks politically incestuous, so that they and their allies financially benefited. They also looking into whether she perjured herself. At Noem's intensely awkward house bearing on Wednesday, with her husband sometimes sitting behind her, she was grilled about Lewandowski. So, Secretary Noem, at any time during your tenure as Director of Homeland Security, have you had sexual relations with Corey Lewandowski? Snyder Kaming Dove of California asked, calling Lewandowski unqualified for his job. Noem called the subject tabloid garbage, but I didn't hear a no. In a way, this terrible love story is a triangle. Trump can't quit Corey either, no matter how many times the pit bull pushed aside. Trump sees his first campaign manager as a character, someone who had faith that his brash style could click, that America would adapt to Trump, not the other way around. A Washington scandal involving sex is never very sexy, and it's usually not simply about secret passion. Repercussions ripple far beyond the carnal transgression. Institutions are betrayed and undermined, and so are the people who count on them. Editorial comment. I guess we really don't know what goes on in big business or in government. There's nothing inevitable about a Russian victory in Ukraine. If Moscow has all the cards, why has it achieved so little? Before sunrise on February 24th, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine from 5 directions. Moving quickly, it took swaths of territory in the south and east and quickly reached the outskirts of Kiev, the capital, and Kharkiv, the second largest city in the northeast. The safest assumption then was that the country would be under Russian control in a matter of days. 4 years later, a Russian victory remains stubbornly elusive. Russia's territorial gains are modest, and it controls no regional capitals. Its forces have been moving forward, but only just, and seem unable to exploit any breakthroughs. These meager results have been achieved at a cost of over 1.2 million Russian casualties since the start of the war, according to an estimate by the Center for International Strategic Studies, which call the numbers extraordinary. There is nothing inevitable about a Russian victory in Ukraine. The narrative that Russia has, to quote President Trump, all the cards, and that Ukraine must make big territorial concessions in order to avoid even worse losses, has dominated negotiations. But at this point in the war, it's fair to ask, if Russia has all the cards, why has it achieved so little? Why has its progress been so often frustrated by a much smaller army, resilience, and innovative tactics, as well as Russia's own operational weaknesses? Some of the first steps toward any durable peace agreement is to understand that a Russian victory is not inevitable, and to convince Russia of it. A round of talks among Ukraine, Russia, and the U.S. was delayed last week because of the war in Iran. Many of Russia's failures in Ukraine have their roots in decisions made during the first days in February 22, when Russian forces underestimated their opponents and advanced on too many axes at once. Then they were supposed to be a quick push to Kiev, stalled. Supply lines became overextended, and forward troops became so vulnerable to counterattacks that they had to be withdrawn. Those mistakes turned a short war into a long war. By early 2024, Moscow seemed to have rallied and was confident it could win this long war. Ukraine has been shaken by a disappointing counteroffensive the previous year. It was short of troops and struggling with recruitment. Russia has no problems with recruitment thanks to large sign-up bonuses, and its economy, increasingly on a war footing, was booming, albeit unsustainable. With Ukraine outnumbered and outgunned, and with aid from the United States stalled in Congress, Russia embarked on an offensive that has yet to conclude. But instead of executing blitzkriegs, Russia has made remarkable slow progress, and its casualty rate is staggering. According to estimates, in the past year, Russia roughly 400,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, missing, to acquire around 0.8% of Ukraine territory. And here we are. Neither President Putin's core military objectives nor his political ones for his special military operation have been met. Ukraine retains its independence, and instead of being demilitarized, it has one of the strongest and largest, most hardened armies in Europe. NATO has expanded to include Sweden and Finland, and Germany is once again becoming a serious military power. While Russia has been bogged down in Ukraine, it has become increasingly dependent on China and unable to help its Syrian, Venezuelan, Cuban, and Iranian clients. All revenues have diminished, even with a rally last week, and the economy suffers from high interest rates, inflation, and minimal growth. Given the vast gap between the initial objectives and what has been achieved, Mr. Putin has understandably tried to emphasize success. Last year, he claimed that the cities of Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region and Podroskit in Donetsk were under Russian control. Kupiansk has since been mostly liberated, and Ukrainian forces were fighting in Pokrovsk, the fall of which had been described in various outlets imminent since August of 2024 until January. And Russia has now finally captured Pokrovsk, reduced to rubble, and its railway lines and roads no longer function. Its value is surely ambiguous. Mr. Putin's army has squandered men and material merely to make his boast come true. While the battle has been underway, Ukraine has built up a formidable defensive line to protect the so-called fortress belt of Kostyantynivka. I'll spell that for you. Kostyantynivka. Kostyantynivka. And another one, Druzhkivka, and Kramatorsk, and Solvansk. In Ukraine's main industrial region, it is not surprising that Moscow demands that these cities be handed over without a fight in negotiations. It can have no confidence, even if the war lasted well into 2027. It would be premature to call an offensive that is not yet over a failure, despite the meager gains, high costs, and lack of momentum. But the basic feature of the front line, with troops easily spotted and eliminated, is that it is now extremely difficult to mount a large-scale, fast-moving, massive offensive. That is why Russia's advances have largely depended small-scale infiltration on foot, bikes, or buggies. Mr. Putin has been ready to pay an extraordinary heavy price to achieve his geopolitical ambitions. Perhaps that readiness is why whenever the question of whether Russia can keep the war going is posed, the answer invariably comes back that it can. In Moscow, it may not feel like a proper defeat until Russian troops are in full retreat. Ukraine, of course, has suffered grievously in the past 4 years, in addition to its heavy military losses. Tens of thousands of civilians have been killed. Russian attacks on energy infrastructure have left Ukrainians dealing with regular blackouts and insufficient heat throughout a harsh winter, in which temperatures drop to minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Even so, a majority of Ukrainians continue to oppose territorial concessions and are confident that they can impose even higher costs on Russia, even if Ukraine lacks the means to liberate all its territory from Russian occupation for now. Ukrainian commanders have claimed that Russia has been unable to replace its frontline losses with new fighting recent months and have set a grisly target of inflicting 50,000 casualties a month to bring home to Moscow the costly futility of this war. Russia failed as much since it began its first-scale invasion of Ukraine, but has had some success in creating narrative that its victory in Ukraine is but a matter of time. The first step toward a durable peace is to defeat that narrative. However hard Russia tries and however much pain it inflicts, it cannot subjugate Ukraine. That's a editorial comment. When you read about all the deaths, and he said 50,000 casualties in Ukraine and 400,000, the folly of war. It's Trump's fantasy is crashing down. This is written by Lydia Polgren. The repercussions of the president's reckless war in Iran are just beginning. In Donald Trump's fantasy world, America is invincible and impregnable. Its military is so advanced and skillful that it can pluck a sitting head of a state from a hostile country and deposit him in New York City jail without losing a single soldier. It can slap punitive tariffs on any nation it takes, abandon long-standing alliances on a whim, bomb any country at any time, and freely blow up boats it may suspect of carrying drugs. America's awesome power means it is unfettered by any rules, untroubled by any consequences. As an unfathomable, rich, and sprawling nation, blessed by geography and protected from its enemies by 2 vast oceans, why shouldn't it do what it will? Over the past several days after Trump plunged the United States into a war with Iran, that fantasy of omnipotence has come crashing into reality. Undertaken for unexplained and perhaps unexplainable reasons, the war is being waged in a central node of the global economy against a disciplined, well-armed opponent with anything to lose. America and Israel killed Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and a dozen Iranian leaders on the first day of fighting, but Trump has clearly given little thought to what comes next. Recklessly, he has ignited a widening conflagration with no obvious end in sight. The death toll has already surpassed 1,000 people. For America, the repercussions are just beginning. At least 6 American service members have been killed. The Pentagon, pointedly not ruling our boots on the ground, has said more casualties are likely. Despite relentless attacks on Iran's military installation, the country has responded with relentless force. It has rained missiles and drones not only on American and Israel targets, but also in the Gulf countries, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, chief among them, that play host to American military bases. Airports, hotels, data centers, and energy infrastructures have been struck, causing chaos. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz, a crucial choke point for the export of oil and gas, is all but closed, sending shudders through energy markets. This is a world Trump tries to disavow, complex and interconnected, resiliently interwoven, and yet vulnerable to disruption. The Persian Gulf embodies it like no other place, in a apotheosis of globalization. It is a crossroads of money, people, power, deeply intertwined with not just America's fortunes, but also Trump's personal wealth. More than anything, it shows up in its grounded flights, shattered refineries, and interceptable missiles. The fallacy of Fortress America. Trump neither sought nor received congressional approval, much less international support, for his war, but perhaps the most shocking thing about his cavalier approach is that it seems to have had no idea that the Gulf would be a target. In an interview with CNN on Monday, he professed that Iran's attacks on American allies in the Gulf were probably the biggest surprise, despite the fact that just about every country in the region had warned his administration that Iran would surely attack them in retaliation for an American assault. This thoughtlessness is part of a pattern. For one thing, the Trump administration has given no plausible explanation for the war, offering instead confused and contradictory justification. Secretary of State Marco Rubio even suggested America was effectively bombed into it by the prospect of an imminent Israel attack on Iran. Trump soon weighed in, claiming that he was actually the one who pressured Israel into the venture. His press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, perhaps offered the closest thing to this truth. The president had a feeling, she told reporters on Wednesday, that Iran was going to strike the United States. For another, Trump appears strangely uncertain about whether the war is heading. The worst case would be if we do this and then somebody takes over who's as bad as the previous person, Trump mused on Tuesday, seated in the gilded Oval Office alongside Chancellor Friedrich Merz of Germany. We didn't want this to happen, he said, seemingly to be considering this very real possibility for the first time. It would probably be the worst. It is unsettling how often Trump affects astonishing indifference, as though the most powerful man in the world were merely a spectator to events he himself has set in motion, and who in any case has little investment in the outcome. But that curious passivity reveals a darker truth. Trump seems to believe that he, like his fantasy America, exists in a different plane, utterly untouchable by the swirl of global events. The devastating consequences of his actions are not just someone else's fault. They are someone else's problem, too. The illusion cannot survive contact with material reality. The post-war consensus was built partly on a set of noble ideas in human rights, international law, but in truth its backstop was economic interdependence. And not since World War II has there been a conflict that unfolded in a crucial global financial center. America's major wars since then took place in nations that were on the economic periphery: Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. America's last major foray in the Middle East cast a long shadow over the Arab War. It was in many ways the crucible that gave us Trump. But the Gulf is a fundamentally different place than it was when America invaded Iraq after 9/11. Disastrous as that decision was, the region had not yet become the indispensable node of the global economy that it is today. There are the oil and gas, of course. The Gulf is home to about half of the world's proven reserves of oil. They are now in peril. Scarcely any ships are getting through the Strait of Hormuz, and oil producers are running out of storage space. What more? 1/5 of the world's liquid natural gas comes through the strait, primarily from Qatar. On Wednesday, that country shut down its liquefaction facilities and declared a force majeure with potentially dire implications for importers in Europe and East Asia. An editorial comment, I'm not sure let me read that sentence again. On Wednesday, that country shut down its liquefaction facilities and declared a force majeure. I don't know what the word majeure means. Might be French, maybe it means great. It's M-A-G-E-U-R-E. Yet alongside this resource wealth, Gulf nations have rapidly diversified in recent decades, transforming the region into a center of finance, aviation, technology, tourism, as well as a home to tens of millions of people from across the globe. The sprawling airports and vast fleets of airliners in Dubai, Doha, and Abu Dhabi have made the region the busiest flight hub on the globe. About 80% of the world is an 8-hour flight away. The closure of these airports has not only strained hundreds of thousands of travelers, including many Americans, but also served vital links between vast regions of the world. Indeed, there are few people who would have better reasons to appreciate the Gulf's centrality than Trump. After all, his family's company has struck billions of dollars in real estate deals in the region. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, got $2 billion in 2022 from Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth for his private equity company. An investment firm tied to the UAE purchased nearly half of Trump's family cryptocurrency for $500 million just a day before Trump's inauguration. A few months later, Qatar gave Trump the lavish gift of a gilded Boeing 747. That is all in peril now as the war spreads ominously. On Tuesday, America torpedoed an Iranian warship with a crew of an estimated 100 people on board off the coast of Sri Lanka. More than 2,000 men from Iran on Wednesday's NATO forces shot down a missile headed into Turkey's airspace, prompting anxieties about NATO needing to trigger Article 5. On Thursday, Azerbaijan said multiple drones crossed in borders, injuring at least 2 people. Who knows what will be next? And yet, Trump presses on, declaring at one point that the war could go on forever. In a manic briefing on Wednesday, Defense Secretary Peter Hegseth promised death and destruction from the sky all day long over Tehran, a densely populated city of about 10 million people. This was never meant to be a fair fight, and is not a fair fight. We are punching them while they're down, which is exactly how it should be. Watching Hegseth rant about limitless killing, I remembered the words of the anti-colonial poet and leader, Aimé Césaire. The hour of the barbarian is at hand, he wrote in his discourse on colonialism in 1950. The modern barbarian, the American hour, violence, excess, waste, mercantilism, bluff, conformism, stupidity, vulgarity, disorder. If war is God's way of teaching American geography, perhaps it will also serve as a lesson to Trump. It should be a simple one. Other places and other peoples are real, possessing their own agenda and agency. In America, sections have consequences you cannot control. Anything else is pure fantasy. America won't save Iran. When I saw the images of bombs falling on Iran, the smoke rising over neighborhoods I once knew, and heard the familiar talk of liberation and an opportunity for Iranians to reclaim their country, I felt recognition that hope was almost immediately. This is written, by the way, by a gentleman by the name of Reza, R-E-Z-A, Asian, a writer, scholar of religion, who is the author of An American Martyr in Persia. I have lived inside the story for most of my life, first as a child in Iran, then as an immigrant to the U.S., and later as someone trying to explain my country to Americans who often encounter it only in moments of crises. I have seen before how things unfold when an American president is cast as Irene's savior. The year was 1977. I was 5 years old, standing on the side of Tehran Street when President Jimmy Carter's motorcade drove by. The revolution had not yet interrupted, but it was already rumbling beneath the surface. To the outside world, the Shah's regime projected strength and modernity, highways, oil wealth, grand celebrations of imperial history. But behind the spectacle lay prisons, censorship, and the quiet terror of the secret police. Political parties had been hollowed out, dissent punished. Even as a child, I could feel the tension in the air, but I do not recall the slogans or the speeches that day. What I remember is the adults around me leaning forward, whispering that the American president was different. He would hold the Shah accountable. He would protect the Iranian people. Back then, I carried an image of America as something almost mythic. It was not just a defiant superpower. It was a moral force, a place that corrected wrongs, defended the vulnerable, tipped history toward justice. In my childhood logic, America was the grown-up who suddenly appeared on the playground to put the class bully in his place. Back then, I carried an image of America as something most mythic. It was not just a distant superpower. It was a moral force. That was the hope in the air, that the visiting American president might act not merely as a guest or the regime, but as a check upon it, that he might be in some way a liberator. Instead, Mr. Carter toasted the Shah's rule and called Iran an island of stability. Something shifted that day, not only in the politics of the country, but in the psyche of the Iranian people. The belief that American power might rescue us dissolved into something harder and more sober. The realization that American interest and the aspirations of the Iranian people simply did not align. 10 years later came the revolution, then the storming of the U.S. Embassy, then the 444 days of the hostage crisis that would brand Iran in the American imagination for decades, nearly half a century of mutual suspicion allowed. Two nations using each other as mirrors, each reflecting back a distorted image against which it could define its own virtue. One cast as the great saint, the other flattened into a caricature of religious fanaticism. And now, once again, the old fantasy of America as savior is returning. Recent days, Americans and Israeli strikes have largely targeted sites associated with Iran's military infrastructure. The official justification is elastic: deterrence, security, stabilization, terms broad enough to stretch around almost any action. The rhetoric around the campaign, however, is as clear as can be. Hours after the first bomb fell on Tehran, President Trump addressed the Iranian people directly, urging them to take over your government after having promised that help is on its way. This was the language not of deterrence, but of deliverance. An American president stepping in as Iran's liberator. Unlike in 1977, however, the loudest voices advancing this narrative are not in Tehran, but in Los Angeles, the city where I live at home to the largest Iranian population outside Iran. On any given afternoon, you can walk past Persian bookstores and jewelry shops and bakeries perfumed with cardamom and rosewater, satellite television studios broadcasting Persian language, news, and entertainment. Exile here is betrayed. It lives in accents softened, but not erased, in older parents who will never return home, in children who speak Persian imperfectly, but can inherit grief fluently. I, too, carry that same inheritance. My family fled Iran in 1979 with little warning. We arrived in America with almost nothing. In the years that followed, we built new lives while navigating the suspicion and slurs that only intended after the hostage crisis. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from Sunday's March 8th issue of the New York Times Opinion section. We read from the New York Times Opinion section every Sunday at 2 p.m. Your reader has been Dick Shanley, and thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section, followed at 4 by a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Please stay for these readings and more throughout the day, and feel free to contact us with your comments, suggestions, with any questions you may have. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability